I'm Rocio with Rocio at Law and with Amplify podcast. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what Amplify is before I introduce my distinguished guest. So Amplify is both an internal project and a community project. And what I mean by that is internally, it's about finding your voice, really understanding your perspective, your experiences, sorting through the noise, and that might take the form of writing or dialogue or just reflection or prayer. And then Amplify is also a community goal, right? And so there are voices that are always heard. They're kind of the status quo, the mainstream voices. But Amplify is meant to bring out those voices that are maybe not having as much of a platform. So voices of people who are maybe othered, ostracized, disenfranchised, just not in the mainstream and having different kind of life experiences. When the idea for Amplify was first born, it was the end of 2024, before the last presidential election. So I actually didn't realize it was going to be quite as much of an uphill battle to speak and magnify and amplify these issues, these voices, talking about things like immigration, LGBTQ community, mental health, and spiritual deconstruction. But here we are. I think it's now a more important mission than ever. And so I'm here with Robert Callahan.
Hello.
Robert is also a Baylor Law grad, and a practicing attorney at Callahan King.
Yep.
They have a pretty diverse practice in Waco, Texas, so criminal defense, personal injury, family law. Call them if you need a lawyer, and hopefully they can find someone who can take good care of you. But the reason we're actually here today is to talk about Robert's book. And it is called Fire in the Hole: Embracing Our Righteous Anger with White Christianity and Reclaiming Our Wholeness. And it's a book that took my breath away. Much needed read, very, very much something that resonated. So thank you for being here. Thank you for writing your book and giving voice to these issues.
Thank you.
I lost my mic.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's what I was afraid of. Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. I'm honored.
Yes, so I want to start with a couple of background questions, just like lawyers do, and talk about how it is that you got into writing.
So I never expected to be an author is one of the things that's so funny about this experience. I think that this was really birthed from 2020 and 2021 and all the turmoil that was going on in our country, as well as my own deconstruction process. I just started writing in order to really work out all of the feelings that I was processing and to gain vocabulary for what I was feeling but couldn't articulate. And I think that first week or so I had probably written the equivalent of about 4 chapters.
Wow.
And at that point, I didn't think that I was writing a book. I just, thought that I was getting some thoughts out on the paper, and I was really active on Facebook back then, RIP. And, and I thought, is this a Facebook post? Is this a letter to the editor? What is this? And I just kept writing because it felt good to do it. And then, probably 8 months later, I realized, I think this is a book.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm glad you wrote it. Like I said, very, very good stuff to read, especially at this point in my life. I did want to ask too how you decided to become a lawyer. I know it happened for you at a very early age.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have a diverse audience of people that watch me. I look at the statistics, the age groups, the countries people are watching from. I think there's a lot of people that would look up to me and to you watching, and I want to share kind of how you got on this legal path.
Yeah, I knew that I was going to be a lawyer when I was 11 years old. I grew up in Louisiana, Shreveport, Bossier, in the 80s, in a time and place where it wasn't necessarily apropos to be black in the community. And so I had a really difficult time. It was a largely white community that we were in. My parents were middle class, and they were the sort of first generation in our family to lift themselves up into that economic class. And so they wanted the best for us. So we went to schools that were predominantly white, churches that were predominantly white. And one of the artifacts of that was that my mother would come home and just be in mourning on a regular basis, in tears, because someone had said something inappropriate to her in public. Today we call those things microaggressions. Back then it was just racism, And I realized pretty quickly that there are these things called lawyers who fight for justice. And that was what sort of set me on the path of social justice and what does it mean to stand up and advocate for other people. And so I determined at that point that that's what I was going to be, and there was nothing you could convince me to be otherwise.
That's awesome. That's very good to hear. Obviously, we're going to focus on the book today. Mm-hmm. I think we could have you speak on 10 different topics, including law, including your life experience. And in some ways, I felt underqualified to interview you on the book.
No.
So for me, I was not raised in the church. I am a very late comer to the faith. I really got plugged into a church in 2018, and I want to credit kind of the man who brought me in, to the faith, Colin Packer. He was a pastor, and he shared a post about Botham Jean that went super viral. I mean, like 88,000 shares, right, online. And I lived in the neighborhood that where his church was located.
Wow.
And so I was like, oh, this guy's down the street. He sounds very social justice oriented. I want to start going to church, look into it, see if there's a place that clicks for me. And I dove right in. He baptized me the following year in 2019, and to this day, we march together with Collin County NAACP and different organizations like that. He is a white, blue-eyed man, okay?
Wow.
And he is no longer with the church, we will put it that way. And there was a lot of frustration on my part. I did, like you, have an exit interview when I left the church. It was very painful. It was a very difficult time, especially because I had this just flame, on fire for the Lord, getting baptized, getting in the church, real spiritual awakening for me, kind of contrasting against what's going on here with, the pastor kind of being edged out and certain public statements being made about LGBTQ community. And it was just a real time of being at odds. So like I said, on the one hand, I feel underqualified to get into this because I haven't been there for 40 years or anything like that. It's still pretty fresh. But on the other hand, it's such a prevalent and prominent issue that even in my short time I've experienced with the church, a lot of what's discussed in the book.
And if I can just speak to that,
yeah.
The fact that you did come into faith later, I actually think lends more credibility to your observations, because this culture and this bubble that we tend to inhabit, that's all new for you. And even with that being the case, you saw all the issues. And of course, having that same passion, that same fire for God and wanting to communicate that to the church staff, I mean, it just lends credibility to the fact that you don't have to be a theological expert to encounter these issues, observe them, and say there's something wrong with that.
I appreciate that. And I was reading part of the book where you say having these conversations is like throwing a grenade, right? Yep. It's not a really gentle thing that you can do because the issue is so adversarial. Yep. It is so heated, right? And so I kind of dramatically, in this group chat that I had with all the other women, we had like an online DMing kind of thing. I was like, I'm removing my card from the bank, or my card from the, giving to the church, and and I'm leaving, and I'm out of here, and everybody knew why. They knew the statement that had just been issued, and for a lot of the women in the group, that brought us together. I ended up actually employing one of them. Some have hired me for their legal issues, so a lot of the people in the community felt the same, and there was kind of this exodus of a large number of us. So if you could just tell everyone kind of your turning point, when this happened for you.
Yeah, I, in hindsight, started my deconstruction process in 2015.
And before we get too far, can you just define deconstruction for the newcomers?
That's great. That's also consistent with being lawyers, right? Let's define the terms for the jury.
Yes.
Yeah, so I consider deconstruction to be the thought of just reconsidering and really breaking down the foundations of our faith. Why do I believe what I believe? Where did this belief come from? Who taught it to me? What is their expertise? Is that a valid understanding of what it means to be a Christian, of whatever flavor Christian that you may be? And so I think that you can deconstruct a lot of different things, but for me, it's been about what I call white Christianity, specifically Christianity in white centered spaces that can be the evangelical church, but it's not restricted to evangelicalism. I see it in Catholicism, I see it in Methodist churches, I see it in all sorts of denominations. So my deconstruction process went back to 2015. I was at a largely white church in Central Texas, and I call the church TFI in
Yes.
the book, Toxic Fellowship, Inc., and the names are changed to protect the guilty. And right before the 2016 election, you could see there was a lot of ramping up of all the political talk, and our pastor ended up giving a sermon where it was really clear that he was endorsing the president, and it caused a schism in the church. And a lot of us were trying to understand, why would he do that? Does he not understand where all these different people are coming from in the church? There's a lot of ethnic diversity and ideological diversity. And so I really tried to educate and to partner with and to come alongside and all those things with the pastor and the head staff. And eventually I realized that it wasn't an ignorance issue. They were really steering the church where they wanted to go. So by 2019, we decided that we couldn't stay there anymore. And that's really what projected me out of TFI.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is kind of how I read the book, is there's almost two competing forces,
Yep.
right? There's one that is the desire for power, the lure of power is at the epicenter, it's about maintaining control, right? And then the kind of flip side of that is what evangelicalism should be teaching, which is the love of neighbor as a governing dynamic of the gospel,
That's
right?
exactly right.
As, again, a newcomer to the faith, as an adult, I'm like, this whole book's about love. This whole book is about charity, about the downtrodden. Like, how is the church looking like this? And the actual Bible, the red letters of the Bible look so different,
Right.
from what I'm seeing. So that's kind of where I saw it, is this pull between these two dynamics. So it wasn't really news to me that power is centralized, right? But when I was reading your book and you mentioned Dr. Robin DiAngelo, her book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, I was actually kind of astonished by the statistics. And just to kind of make sure, the audience knows, it says 82% of teachers were white. Gatekeepers of book publication and TV show production were 90 and 93% white, respectively. 100% of top U.S. military advisors were white, and it just goes on. And these are the people who tell us what we live in, right? What does this country stand for? What are our ideals? Even the kind of notion of we're equal and their social mobility, like those are the people we learn that from. And
Right.
just learning that like such a high percentage of those voices that really shape our perspective are white voices was a shock to me.
Yeah, and I think that was during, at that point, the 2018 era or so, and I'm sure that number has only increased since then. And it really does show you whose narrative is being projected into the church, into the community, and that's the water we swim in.
Right. And one thing that I was thinking about literally on the way over here, obviously we're going to tell everyone to buy your book at robertgcallahan.com.
There you go.
And I'm like, for now, it's not a banned book. But it might be, like that's kind of the era that we live in. You have something to say on that.
What's interesting is right before the book launched, this was September of 24, Target had agreed to sell the book. And so you could get it on Target's website. I have some old posts where I was so happy and I'd taken screenshots of the fact that you could get it at Target.
Look, Mama, I'm on Target.
And then either the end of September or right early October is when they announced their DEI rollback. And so all of a sudden, there were a ton of books that were by Black authors and Black art and things like that that got pulled out of the Target stores. And that started the national boycott, but it was just interesting that I saw that directly affect me.
Wow, yeah.
And so yeah, it's not yet a banned book like you say, but from a practical standpoint, if the gatekeepers are determining where you can obtain these resources, then yeah, it essentially is.
Wow, I had no idea. That's very interesting. And I feel like more people have stories like that, right? Where it's like we heard about, rollbacks on DEI. We heard about changes in immigration, and now it's like it's hitting home. It's you, it's your neighbor, it's your family. It's so prevalent that it's really touching lives in a non-abstract way, in a very tangible way. So one of the things that stood out to me about the book is that you kind of encouraged us to be angry. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that anger is a catalyst. It helps us to propel ourselves out of toxic spaces. And especially in white Christianity, we have this sense that we should never be angry. We should never really express our true selves because we have to be winsome, or if we're minorities, we really have to fit in, and that means that we can't complain and that sort of thing. And so we're really taught an understanding of the gospel that makes us think that God doesn't want our authentic true selves revealed. We just have to be positive and God's going to bless us and pray it away and all that. And what I realized is when you think about the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, you have denial, depression, bargaining, anger, and then eventually acceptance. And of all of those, anger is the only one that helps you do something. Denial, that's going to be debilitating. Like, why is it that brother so-and-such doesn't see what I see? And it'll drive you crazy. And then bargaining, maybe if I stay here, then I can be the one to change the environment of this entire machine from the inside out, or depression. Like, all these things can be just debilitating and cause us to freeze, but anger has an element of productivity to it. It helps us to move from fawn or from freeze into flight or fight. And in this case, helps us to escape the gravity well of the toxic environments that we're inhabiting. It gives us enough speed to achieve escape velocity. And so that's the main value for me.
Yeah, I know people kind of joke about the two sides of my personality, because people will say, you can be the sweetest person I've ever met. You would give me the shirt off your back. Like, I know I can come to you for anything. People do come to me, things I won't broadcast, but everything from legal help, financial help, whatever they can come to me with, and I'm here to love them, right? But it's, why do I do what I do in my profession? Why do I show up at my kid's school to talk to the leadership there? It's anger, right? It's that sense of there's something not right, there's something unjust, and there's something that needs to be done about it, And I don't know that I had a lot of people model that for me, when I was growing up. We are first generation immigrants, so it was very don't rock the boat. We're kind of lucky to be here. It's a privilege and opportunity that a lot of people back home don't get. And I get that. I wake up every day and I thank God that I get to be a lawyer and I get to be here and my kids are safer now and things like that. But there's still a lot wrong that needs to be righted. And like you said, just that passion, that anger is the best fuel to keep you going. We almost have to kind of, with my team, I like to pull back the curtain. I like to tell them how the laws are made and where, certain dollars go to certain candidates and the lobbies and things like that. Because I'm like, if you know who's orchestrating, if you know who's creating what justice is, then you're more passionate about getting it right. You see kind of how the system is stacked. But okay, so that was something that I feel like I'm still unresolved about. I think the Black community calls it more code switching or something like that. But it does feel like there's someone that I need to be or needed to be to get where I am, right? To be in certain spaces. But then there's also the when nobody's watching, when I'm with the people I'm comfortable with, when I'm with the familiar, that kind of person comes out and it's different, and I just would love to hear your thoughts and, to speak to that. Like I said, it's still just kind of a tension that I'm like, am I being my inauthentic self? Am I being fake or am I being, a part of me that needs to exist to have the things that I have, right?
Yeah. And I think that for a time, all of us in some way or another have to sort of, adopt the posture and the lingo and adapt to the culture that we're surrounded in. That may be in a law school context, or if you're not a lawyer, there's still going to be some situation. Women having to interact with men in the workplace in a predominantly male-centered space. But I think the issue is when we finally get to the point where I've broken in or I've achieved the degree or whatever have you, we tend to continue the momentum of staying in that disguise. And what I want to articulate for people is in the context of spirituality that, for marginalized people, for minorities, women, the LGBTQ community, for us, it is okay for us to show up in these spaces as our true authentic selves. One of the analogies that I use is the mimic octopus and how you can, go snorkeling or whatever have you and see an octopus that shifts and will change not just its color, but its shape, its texture, in order to mimic the coral that it attaches itself to. And that idea of it being a defensive mechanism, and that's what it's like for us as minorities a lot of the time, that we're in these predominantly white spaces and we're being asked to shift all of who we are, to change and to adapt. And then eventually we can sort of forget our true shape. And when we leave those spaces and we are in environments where we are comfortable and we're able to exhale, then all of a sudden we realize, oh, wow, I've been holding those muscles for all that time. And one of the examples that I found of that is that in the church that I was in, TFI, it was taboo to talk about social justice issues. When I left, I went to a church where talking about social justice was just normative. It was part of the regular flow of what we understand it means to be a Christian. That made me understand that the reticence that my former church had in talking about those issues wasn't because they didn't know how to. It was really a lack of integrity, not because they were ignorant.
Got it. Yeah. One of the things that struck me about the book too was about how white supremacy carries all these other issues with it, right? So you said walks hand in hand with the patriarchy. Like it's got tentacles, right, of different things that it needs to have to perpetuate itself. Can you talk a little bit about that, you know?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm starting to realize more and more is that, you know, patriarchy and white supremacy in the United States, it's really both systems are about white male dominance. And going back to, you know, our founding documents, it was white male landowners who were what the founding fathers had in mind when they were talking about, you know, all persons are created equal. And so it's only when we realize that these two things work together that we can attack the root problem, which ultimately I believe is white supremacy. I I was thinking about on the way here how ironic it is that there's I'm not sure if I should mention the public officials, but I think everyone would know who I was talking about. But there's a head public official that has a spiritual advisor that is a woman in the United States, and then his junior has a spiritual advisor who is just publicly, very vocally misogynistic. And I kind of wonder, do they not understand that they're in the same room together holding hands? And of course they do, but the goal being this sort of dominance of white supremacy, they'll hold hands together even though they disagree about those things in order to achieve the agenda. So it's
Right.
interesting.
Right. And that's something so surprising how much buy in there is, how much there is the willing to bite your tongue or, be in the room with someone who has, voted away or spoken in a way that's directly antagonistic to you if you just get to sit at the table,
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I'm not built for that. I'm not. I won't name my sister, but she's an elected official, and I'm like, she can just get along with everyone, and she's very passionate. She's very, has done a lot of important work in different boards and organizations we've served in. But I'm like, it is so hard for me to just not speak up and not speak out and not interject and not, in these scenarios. But that's how I'm wired, right? And I think there's an importance to both. I get to do things like this, and she gets to do things like that, which is huge. She's the first Latina to serve on school board in our city, and that's huge.
It's amazing.
And it shouldn't have taken this long. We're in Texas, look how many Latinos there are. Okay, so how do we move forward, right? We have this vision of what the church is supposed to be. We have this awakening moment where we realize this is an agenda that's not biblical, right? This is an agenda that's perpetuating itself and perpetuating power. What do we do to move forward? Where do we go from there?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to realize that we're not alone, because that's what is so debilitating about being a believer who was all in on the idea of every nation, tribe, and tongue together, gathered around the throne of God and worshiping God. And that's the vision that we were sold in mainstream evangelicalism. And I think understanding that we're not crazy for feeling what we're feeling ostracized, feeling that our voices are being minimized, feeling that we're being erased. We're not crazy. It's not you. You're not alone. And so there's a community, there's a beloved community, as Martin Luther King would refer to, that we can invest in. And as we're investing in one another, we build each other up, we strengthen each other, we build better, stronger communities. And then I think that, sort of going to what you were talking about just a minute ago, it takes practice to learn to speak out. That's, it's like a muscle that you haven't really trained when you're exiting these spaces. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean that, you're going and, posting stuff online right away, or that you're blowing up the internet or writing a book or whatever it is. But there's a sense of, hey, it used to be that I would let that just slide, but now I have to say something. And you need to know, if you're, in my community, in my presence, and you're a friend of mine and you say something that's out of pocket, you need to know that there's a line there and that I'm not going to tolerate that. And so we've changed the culture, we've changed the norm. Hopefully the idea is that, one, we get stronger in elevating our own voices, but two, that we inspire those around us to use their voices as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. When you talked about kind of churches that are stuck, for lack of a better word, they're not changing. They're not changing in the direction that we want them to. You mentioned apathy, ignorance, inaction as kind of being the trifecta of reasons. I want to hear more about that. And I think where, I don't know, maybe I'm giving too much of the benefit of the doubt, but I feel like sometimes it does depend on the person, not at the church writ large, right? But I do want to hear kind of about those three.
Yeah, when I was writing about that, I actually was thinking about, I'm such a pop culture nerd. And
I
Jen-
love it. I love the references.
Good, I'm glad.
I've seen that movie. I get that one,
And so, everything from Star Wars, Star Trek, but I thought about Boys in the Hood, and there's a scene in there where Ice Cube is talking about the passing of one of his relatives and how the community doesn't seem to care about it. He says that they either don't know, don't show, or don't care about what's going on in the hood. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, yeah, that's kind of what's happening here, is that it's either that they don't know, it's ignorance, or they don't show, it's inaction, or they don't care, which is like apathy. They don't, and so I realized, okay, if ignorance is the reason that these spiritual leaders are not speaking into these issues, can we give them the benefit of ignorance in the year of our Lord 2026?
Right.
6 years after 2020, after Botham Jean, after Ahmaud Arbery, after Philando Castile, after Breonna Taylor, after George Floyd, can we really get in the information age, where we have the ability to get on our phones and to attain a repertoire, a repository of all the world's information in any language that we want to, from a satellite up in space into our hands in moments. In the information age, is there an excuse for ignorance? I would say no.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the testament to that is those who have escaped, those who have done the work and realized, oh my goodness, there's things to learn, and I'm going to leave this toxic type of state of mind, this white supremacist kind of state of mind, ideology as it affects Christianity. And so it can't be ignorance. So then if they're not showing, if they don't know, then they're not showing. Why are they not showing? Well, there's too many resources, that are available. If we're talking about inaction, the fact that your brother and sister are hurting and they're calling for your help, that there's a need there and you recognize it, you understand that should prompt action, And so we can't excuse that. And so then the last thing is they don't care. It has to be apathy. It has to be that they know there's just too many resources available. It has to be that they understand how to move the needle politically, socially when they want to, letter writing campaigns and protests and all the things if it's something that they care about, they'll certainly invest in fighting those things. But when it comes to us, it's different. And so what I determined is that we can't give them any excuses. And so therefore, it's time for us to leave.
Well said. Very well said. One thing that I thought was really interesting was you kind of talked about the church body outside of the church. And, when I did stop going to the church where I was baptized and everything like that, I did start attending a home church, as in the living room, nobody's dressed up or anything. We're just kind of having snacks and still loving Jesus, right? And
Yeah.
still, it's not I broke up with my faith. It's not I turned away from Christianity. It's the church body wasn't what I thought it should be. It wasn't in line, right? And so I want to hear more about that, kind of just the different ways that you've continued with church, right, after kind of turning away from the church you were at.
Yeah, I realized that I wasn't having a crisis of faith. I was having a crisis of fellowship
Oh,
because I knew I still
yeah.
loved Jesus. And part of my deconstruction was I knew that it was important for me going into it to maintain my faith. I was flexible with wherever deconstruction sent me, but at the same time, I knew that Jesus was everything for me. And so as I was processing through my deconstruction process and leaving church, looking for different churches and things like that, I wanted to make sure that I was still holding on to Jesus at the end of the day. It was it was it was so humbling for me to realize I don't know what I thought evangelicalism and missions work and ministering was before. I thought of it as go there and preach to those people. And I realized when I left that space that there were people around me literally in arm's reach who were just suffering, and they were suffering at the hands of the ideology that I came out of. And so, the LGBT community, there were people who weren't comfortable coming out because I was part of the toxicity that was hurting them. So I couldn't be a resource. I couldn't be a protection, a safe haven for them. There were women who had been saying the things that I was just beginning to observe as it applied to racism. They've been saying it about misogyny for years, and I'd looked past it, and I wasn't a safe space. And so I realized, like, these are people that need to be loved and to be ministered to. There's so much ministry work that can be done here. And so church community for me became about community, not about a building. And so there was a good year and a half where we didn't go to church at all. I couldn't. I could not stand in a praise and worship setting where I didn't know whether or not I was safe, either physically or emotionally. I couldn't close my eyes and raise my hands and sing. Absolutely not. And so now, we go to different churches. When I do go, I go maybe once a month, honestly. I, I have just found that it's okay and it's great if it's important to you to stay in a church community, whether that be a home church or that be a building or whatever have you. But it's also okay to say, you know what, I don't know how I feel about this. I need a break. I need to reassess some things. I need to breathe and really think about what's important to me and pare my faith down to the bare essentials. That's completely okay.
Yeah. And I think there is a lot of pressure to be organized, be in an institution, kind of be in a structure. But then, some of the most life changing conversations I've had, some of the most, intimate moments of my spiritual life, they're happening with 2 other people. They're happening with 5 other people. They're happening in a place we didn't even plan,
Right.
for a conversation or an experience to happen. And I think that's kind of antithetical, especially to, my household didn't go to the Catholic Church much, but we're around, obviously, the Catholic community. Like I said, a bunch of families came from El Salvador at the same time. Most of their children went to Catholic schools and everything, so it's very cultural to, this is what we do. This is what we do. You're kind of being not part of your culture or kind of a betrayal to your family almost if you're not participating in the way everybody else is participating. But then, I feel right with myself. I know I love Jesus. I know I read the word. I know I've passed it to my children, and that relationship isn't gone. It's just, like you said, the fellowship. The fellowship is taking different forms and different evolutions. I do want to hear your thoughts on that. You do mention in the book a couple of times, largely the Catholic community. It wasn't just the evangelicals, right? That
Right.
that kind of voted our people in that are in office right now. Um, So how does that happen in the churches that aren't really white? You know, how is it that this is such a prominent keep the people in power who are there and not challenging the system for people who are also not white but not black? You
Yeah.
know.
One of the things that when I was talking about the definition of white Christianity is I kind of loosely define it as a culture in which we understand everything that the Bible requires of us when it comes to the poor, the widow, the orphan, the marginalized. And we have people in these communities, marginalized people, who are able to speak into that, and yet it's ignored, it's disregarded in lieu of this whitewashed version of Christianity. And so when we're talking about community, and we're talking about even minorities can be perpetrators of white Christianity. I myself, as I discussed in the book, there's a period in time where I considered myself a conservative. And I was, the water that I swam in was conservatism, and it wasn't white Christianity. And so I spoke like, dressed like, looked like. And so therefore, I was a perpetrator of those same ills. As a marginalized community member, I was also a misogynist. I was part of this patriarchy. I was part of the problem. And so, especially when you're talking about being close to power, when you're wanting to have an impact on the kingdom and you're wanting to do good things and be in church leadership and all those other things, you can start to lose yourself and to compartmentalize yourself, set your true self aside in order to fit the mold of the environment, like we were talking about. And in the process of doing that, become the thing that is yourself you're trying to overcome. Become the thing that requires you to wear the camouflage. And so I do see in minority communities that there's a thought that if we're close to power, then we can avoid the difficulty of being a minority. And so that's the temptation that comes with inhabiting those spaces. And so I just encourage people to recognize that there's a danger there, that we ourselves can become the thing.
Yeah. And I think there is, some of the people who love me, who are a bit older, they've kind of pushed back when I've made more public posts about what I believe or how I feel about things, and said, you're a small business owner. What if you lose customers? What if you turn people away? I appreciate that. They're looking out for me, and they're shaped by their worldview. But I feel like the opposite has happened. I feel like there's so many people searching for the safe spaces, for the like-minded, for the, I don't want to have to question what this person stands for or guess or, wonder what they say once they hang up the phone after the call. They want to know, and they appreciate you broadcasting it, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just curious what your experience has been. Obviously, this book is very big. It's really getting to be well known. How has that played in with your practice?
Very similarly, I had that same concern. I went into private practice in 2011.
Okay.
And so my idea was to be all things for all people. And I realized as I was speaking out that people don't come to you because of what you do, they come to you because of who you are. What I mean by that is what you believe in, your mission. And so, examples of that are, I can be a lawyer and be good at my job, and, suck as a person. But, if I say that I love Jesus, I don't have to prove that with my words. I can prove that by how I treat my clients, by how I interact with opposing counsel, by the cases that I take, by the stance that I take, the advocacy that I do. I don't have to necessarily use words. And so what I found is as I was changing, people were coming to me because they were seeing that I was a safe space. And it didn't keep the other people from coming to me because they still knew that I was good at what I do.
Yes.
And so
I saw some of your accolades and things,
oh,
and I
thank
mean,
you.
obviously, you're very well known for what you do and doing a good job, and your oral advocacy, and these kind of things. And I think you're right. I mean, some people, it surprised me, once I started my firm. Some of the people who sent me business, who I knew, they knew from people I'd supported for office, maybe against them, we're not ideologically aligned, but for a lot of people, the work product does speak for itself.
That's right.
And then for the others, they really need to know
Yeah.
that you're gonna see them the way they want to be seen.
Yeah.
One thing that is a bit of a struggle for me is I want to do something grandiose. I love hearing about the civil rights movement, these cases that have gone to the Supreme Court, these big watershed moment kind of things. And I was reading your book, and really it stuck out to me how you talk about the lamp unto your feet. And it's not about this flashlight or spotlight into, okay, because I have this awakening, here's what I need to do. Here's the big target I'm moving towards. It's really about moving differently in the day to day, about looking for those opportunities right there at your feet, right there at the lamplight to do different work. And so I started trying to really honor that perspective, because on the one hand, I'm like, I haven't accomplished anything great. And then I'm like, let's look back. Let's look back at some of the things I've done. I'm just going to give an example, something that I'm very proud of. I really got involved with NAACP around the same time that I joined the church, because it was a lot of the same issues that were concerning me, that were going on in our community, our society. And they didn't have a lot of lawyers or legal assistants or people with legal know-how, so they gave me a seat, co-chair of legal redress. And I was able, through that position, to help people expunge their records. And we got, the court cost waived, and it was the first of its kind in Collin County to have that program. So big deal. Big press conference, all the things. And then I'm sitting there with the people who we're completing the applications for. And they're telling me, Rocio, I got accepted to college, but I can't get into housing because of my record. I'm trying to move to the town where the school is, and I can't because of these things that are showing up, or just different situations like that where I'm like, people are being held back from their potential. They're being held back from what they can offer and give to the community. They're being held back from their gifts that God endowed them with because of something that I can do something about, and maybe it's not grandiose in the grand scheme of things. It's not going to be in a history book, but the person sitting across from me, it's life-changing. It's a huge game changer. It just opens opportunity that they might not otherwise have. And so I'm trying to be more of that mindset, of like, look at the big impacts you've made in small ways, right? And just kind of these daily walks, and to keep your eyes out for it and not be myopic and not be focused on some big grandiose goal, and really more the daily activities.
Yeah, just doing the next right thing is so important. I started off, and when I went into private practice in 2011, I was in an office that was 10 by 14, no windows. And it was a slow death for me because I knew that I was an extrovert and I like interacting with people. And so I painted the walls Tuscan gold so that there would be like this feeling of sort of like I'm seeing the sunlight,
Oh, wow.
And so
I'm not a prisoner.
right. And so for the first year and a half, I was just by myself doing that. And I never would have imagined in 2011 that fast forward to 2026, I own a business with my business partner. We're doing 3 different practice areas. We have 13 people on staff. The idea that I would be doing all these huge things back then would have completely been out of the realm of possibility in my mind. I didn't strive for these things either. It's just sort of what happened after the next step and the next step and the next step. And I've found that just being faithful in the little, it creates these opportunities, and it it expands your horizons. It strengthens you and enables you to carry more weight and to do the next thing. And eventually you just realize like, oh, I used to just be on the shore throwing the starfish back in, to kind of use that old poem, but now I'm kind of upstream more, and I can sort of figure out, why is it that they're ending up in that place in the first place, and maybe I can do more to rescue from a different perspective.
So we kind of described or defined deconstruction. White Christianity is obviously a term that we're going to use a lot in this conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about what's meant by that?
Yeah, so in the book, I define white Christianity as a shorthand to describe those whose orthodoxy and orthopraxy are dictated by an unshakable yet misguided tangle of faith and right-bridled political and social conviction that are antithetical to everything Christ represents. So if that's the King James version, the NIV version would be white Christianity is also that subset of Christianity that intentionally ignores or does not consciously consider the effects of racism or prejudice in either the church or society, or on the marginalized, nor cares to, having been given the resources and information to do so.
So you're a father as well, and are your children teens? Or?
I've got 2 teens and a preteen.
Okay, so we're kind of in the same age. I got preteens. How are you having this conversation with them?
What's interesting is kids, what's not taught is caught. And so the fact that we have had so many intentional relationships and intentional action in deconstructing and reconstructing our faith, they've seen that process. And so they've been with us when we visited the different churches. We've sat down and had the conversations with them about why we left TFI. They know that Dad wrote a book. They may not have read the book. They probably won't ever read the book. But the point being that, as we go along through life, they are with us. They're with our friends that are in the LGBTQ community. They see that Dad is treating Mom differently, and so they themselves have picked up on so much, and it has just sort of become their norm.
Right. I can totally see that. I do think, when I was talking to my daughter, she wanted to not do sports for a bit, and I said, well, you have to have something to fill your time, especially if it's something that teaches you teamwork or community, that kind of thing. And she automatically was like, I want to do a lot of volunteering. I want to, let's find an organization. She'd heard a bit about it from her cousin, and she's seen so much that I had done. And so now we have her in NCL, National Charity League for girls, and it's just part of her life, right? It's not something that necessarily I saw as much growing up. It really wasn't, something that like my parents or my role models were active in, because they've grown up in it. They just know this is a part of what we do, right? Yeah. I do worry more about one of my children than the other. One is like a copy paste of me, and one looks a bit more like her German father and grandmother, and so I do think they get treated differently, and I worry, right? Because this is a time in our society where, and you can speak to this from a criminal defense perspective, it feels like the reasons that police can interact with you are broader than they've ever been.
Yeah, yeah. And, we have the tough conversations with our children about what it means to be minorities in a society where, sometimes that is a liability and that is a reality. And so, we teach them how to survive those encounters. Don't fight with the officers on the roadside. That Daddy's a lawyer, and we'll fix it after the fact.
Right.
We'll take care of it. But yeah, there are some inescapable realities that unfortunately our children are going to inherit, and I do hate that. I also know that, there were difficulties that you and I dealt with, and all of that is also part of what makes us who we are, and what we're able to do, and the audiences that we're able to speak to. I would rather not have had a deconstruction process, because that was atom smashing, soul crushing, just really introspective work. And I would rather have not felt the pain, but I'm glad now on this side of it that I've been through that and that I've processed it. And now that I can help others that are also going through that and trying to figure out, what do I do with my anger?
Right. You described it at one point as almost like a failed marriage. It's something that, you do get into thinking this is forever. This is a part of who I am. This is sacred. This is, all these different things. And it's not something that you can continue in, right? And be true to yourself.
Yeah.
And that absolutely just, yeah, earth shattering, especially, like I said, being newer to it. I'm like, I just got here. I went through this, intensive rooted program. I got to speak at the end of the program, to the other people present, really just in love with Jesus, just absolutely beaming with what I found in the book, the faith to be. And just with that contrast of the fellowship, it does. It feels like the end of a marriage, the end of, this incredible relationship, and trying to move on. Um,
Yeah, I think about how we left not just the building, but so many relationships, so many friendships that were a part of just our regular attendance at that church. We had a small group that we attended on a regular basis, and part of the deconstruction was realizing that the things that we were doing in that small group were sort of facilitating what was going on in the main building. And so the places we frequented, like, it's sort of like being in a divorce, where it's, you drive by this place and it's like, oh, that's where we used to do this thing. And it really is, there's a grieving process that you legitimately have to go through, and that's part of the healing.
and for me, I'm a very stubborn person, and I want to believe it can change. And you talk about that a little bit in the book as well, significantly, how the right thing is oftentimes to walk away, right, from the people and the places that don't serve you. I don't think that's encouraged on the whole in our society, and I think especially for women. I don't handle any divorces. I did in my first couple of years, but so many people reach out to me, and it is their own church community saying, forgive him, reconcile, all these things. And I'm going, that's unilateral. What has he done? Where's his change? Where's his, fixing this situation? Is that kind of what your experience with has been as well?
Yeah, part of the thing when I was going through my healing process was I had to figure out, okay, what is biblical forgiveness? What is biblical repentance? We use these terms and we talk about reconciliation, but what does it all really mean? And what I figured out is that reconciliation is a state of being. It is not a verb. Like we can reconcile, but we talk in the church about reconciliation as though it were the means to accomplish the thing. And what I realize is, there's repentance. That's about my vertical relationship with God. I seek repentance, or I repent for what I've done wrong. Forgiveness, that's about my unilateral posture towards you. And you could potentially be, an ex-spouse who was emotionally abusive, or I use the example of grandparents that have passed away. I can forgive them and they never know about it. They're not even on earth anymore. It is about my heart's posture towards them. So therefore, that means I don't have to necessarily have a continued relationship with them. So I can forgive them without them having access to me, if that is still not a safe relationship for me to be in. And so then when we're talking about, well, how do we get to reconciliation? Well, there's work for both of us to do if that's going to be the case. And that may mean that restitution has to be paid, and I talk about that as a legal term of art. Dollar for dollar. I broke a window. It costs this much to replace the window. That's what I got to give you. Or it may be reparation in terms of it takes a little bit more than what it costs to repair it. Threw a ball through the window, it broke the window, but then I also injured you on the other side of the window. And so now there's a relationship that needs to be restored as well. There may be, medical bills that need to be paid or something like that, but it didn't cost anything to hit you financially, but it costs something to heal you. And then restoration, if you think about classic cars, there are people who will pay just exorbitant sums for an original taillight, an original hood ornament, and they don't care because the goal is to get the thing back to its original glory. And if that costs more, it's worth it. And so that's true in relationships too, is like sometimes if we're talking about restoring the relationship, if you are the injuring party, you are going to have to possibly pay more than you think that you need to, or more than it necessarily costs dollar for dollar in order to restore that relationship. And so when those things happen and it's proven over a sustained period of time that we're committed to this together, then we can have reconciliation.
It's a lot of work. I know we talk a lot about the Christian right? A lot of the vocal Christians in our society are of the right.
Yeah.
There seems to be kind of this blossoming, from my perspective, in my local politics of this kind of Christian left. We have people like James Tallarico running for office and really interweaving his faith perspective on how you treat people. And what do you think of that?
I really think that it's a reflection of just genuineness. I think that people, especially voters, really gravitate to authenticity. And the thing that drew me early on to noticing who Tallarico was, and this is a couple of years ago, was the fact that he was talking about his faith up front as a progressive. And it's not that there was already a Christian left. I think that we just didn't see it for all the noise of the Christian right. And as we're coming away from the toxicity that we experience, we're realizing, I can have faith that is practical and it is faithful to the gospel, and it doesn't mean that I am absent-mindedly just voting red down the line every election. It's really a difficult thing to convince people of in the Bible Belt, especially in Central Texas, which is like the rhinestone jewel in the middle of the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. But there are lots of other people that are stepping forward. Once you begin to look, you realize there's a lot of other voices out there that share our values, their progressive values, but also lead with their faith. And that's, I think ultimately it's not actually a new thing. I just think that maybe it's that we didn't have ears to hear it before.
Ooh, I like that a lot. And you're right. I mean, it was several years ago, I was writing postcards for Raphael Warnock, and there's been a few other very important political leaders who have used the platform and spoken to their faith. But at the same time, I think that's a work in itself, right? So many of the constituents, the potential voters, they've heard about Christianity interwoven with conservatism for so long.
Yeah.
And the hypocrisy of it and everything, that I think there's some apprehension there. Like, if he walks like a duck, talks like, is he a duck, right?
Yeah.
Is he going to be like the rest of them that we've heard from? And how do you move forward from that of, so many people have been wounded by the Christian right. How do we get them to trust a Christian who's not in that way?
I think that's valid. I think that's a valid criticism, and I think that it is incumbent upon us to show long term that we are who we say that we are representing Christ in the world. And I think about Raphael Warnock as a great example of when he gave the speech at the Democratic convention, and he said, I need my neighbors to be okay. I need not just my neighbor that agrees with me, but my religious neighbor, my conservative neighbor, my Palestinian neighbor, my Jewish neighbor. Like I need, as a reflection of the gospel, for all of my neighbors to be okay, and that's authentic to the gospel. That's what it means to really minister.
One area where I just don't understand it. There will be people who, with their church on Sunday, they are doing the food banks or, different things to help people who are at some kind of a disadvantage or in a bad situation. And then they turn around and they kind of vote for the opposite. And I'm going, how do you awaken someone to the structures that you're perpetuating are the whole reason we need to be here on Sunday? How do you have that conversation with somebody? Or do you?
Yeah, it's still, the cognitive dissonance is still surprising to me. I think on one hand, there's just a sense in those sort of large evangelical spaces that are dedicated to, going and doing missions work abroad and giving to a certain nonprofit or the food bank or whatever have you. I think it's just sort of like a sense of like, oh, this is what we do. We're Christians. The Bible says that we're supposed to take care of people that have less. And I don't think we really think about it as like, that is like love God, love neighbor. That is the whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle. And so it's just sort of becomes rote, and they don't understand. They don't really embody the practice and why they're doing what they're doing. The other problem is that sometimes they know exactly what they're doing. And what I found at TFI was, we had a ministry that was dedicated to feeding the homeless, or I should say the unhoused. We had drug rehabilitation programs. We had an anti-human trafficking organization that I volunteered with. We had huge missionary emphasis, and there's all these things that are very socially progressive, but yet it was the religious right. And they didn't see the people that they were ministering to with the same dignity that they saw themselves. And what I realized is that that was sort of the lure. It was sort of like a hook with a worm on it. The way that we're going to get the young people in here is that they want to invest in something. They want to make a difference in the world. So we're going to bring them in, train them to be missionaries. They're going to pay tuition to our private institution. and then we're going to send them to, all the far-flung places of the world to go do missions work. That's an attraction. We have a children's ministry, and then we're singing songs, and the kids are learning Bible stories. That's going to bring parents into the church. It's an attraction. It's a draw. We have a drug rehabilitation program that's going to bring people into the church, and they're going to get clean, and then they're going to get jobs and learn to walk and talk and dress like us. So that's an attraction. And so all of these things, they weren't doing them in the case of that congregation for altruistic purposes. They ultimately were doing it as an advertising.
It's branding.
It's branding.
Wow. That's powerful.
It's really hard when you realize, because I had so much just whiplash in how is it that we can do all these things, and yet the pastor is endorsing these candidates. The same pastor he was friends with Ken Paxton. And so whenever Ken Paxton would come into town, he would make sure that Ken was on the front row and waved to the congregation and acknowledged him. And at the same time, we're doing all these different missionary type things.
So with the practice that you have, the law partner that you have, is faith an open discussion in that professional context as well?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I wanted to be intentional about early on was integrating our faith into our practice. But what I also wanted to avoid was sort of the live, laugh, love version.
Yeah.
And so we don't have any, motivational posters. There's no crosses. There's no signs or anything in our office that would demonstrate to you that we're believers. What we believe is that by being excellent, that we are advocating, we're coming alongside people and walking with them in their hardest times. Like, as you're aware, other than weddings and adoptions, there's not a lot great that happens in your local courthouse. There's a lawsuit over a dissolution of a marriage. There's a partnership that's dissolved. There's personal injury. Somebody was hurt and now they're trying to get their life back together. Someone's being prosecuted. There's not a lot of great things that are going on in the courthouse. And so we have this opportunity not just to represent people, but to walk with them through what they're going through. And there's different opportunities that are going to be present depending on the person. But what I don't do is I don't advertise myself as a, quote, Christian attorney. I don't want to use my faith as a sword. I don't want to use it as a shield. If a client has a legitimate gripe with me, I don't want to say, hey, brother, but I'm one of you, and so I see too much of that in other settings, in other industries. I just want people to know that we care about them. That's the best thing that we can do in terms of ministering to people. Love God, love people. And so if we're doing that, eventually they're going to either figure out why we're doing it or they're going to ask questions. If they never ask a question, that's great. I don't feel the need to proselytize to my clients. But I've actually had clients that sent me letters on their way to prison saying, thank you, God bless you, I pray for you, I know that God's using you. And so they caught what was going on even though it wasn't taught.
Absolutely. And that's somewhere where, I'm a year and a half into having my law firm. We're kind of figuring out who we are.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And my first hire is someone I've known since I was 16. And so there's no conveying to her, this is what I stand for. She knows.
Yeah.
She's been there. We've been through the life stuff together. And it really does add to the practice that we know each other, not just professionally, but in this more personal way. We have difficult conversations with clients. People kind of forget personal injury. There's fatalities. There's people who lose their 20-year-old sons. There's difficult moments to go through. And because we have this different kind of relationship, we're able to lean on each other in different ways.
Yeah.
We're able to approach things from a different perspective. And knowing that we have that shared value, it is a big motivator for the way that we serve people, right? I was given this skill set, I was given these interests to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's not something that we advertise. It's so funny, though, that sometimes it does attract clients. I do have other social media presence outside of the firm, and people look you up.
Yeah.
And it's easy when you went to Baylor, when you went to Notre Dame for law, people kind of make assumptions about your faith, and so I definitely have clients who come in and want to talk from that perspective and want guidance from that perspective, want to relate from that perspective. But like you said, it doesn't have to be loud. I know you quote Francis of Assisi in the book, about, you probably know the quote better than I do, but demonstrating your faith, and then if you need to, then use words
if necessary.
Right? Yeah, and it's really nice to have that in a firm. And I've been doing this for 17 years. I feel like every firm that I've been at, there's not a long list, but there's a list, has had a different culture, has had a different mindset about how do we approach the work, what are the goals, what are the driving forces, what are the things you get criticism on? Is it that you settled a case for $3,000 less than you should have, or is it this person on the intake call told you something extremely personal and you didn't meet them in that moment, and we need to be more empathetic, and we need to be more listening because this isn't a client, this is a person.
Yeah.
So still building it, still finding our feet under us, really excited with, the team I have so far. We're a small team. But just kind of learning how that can shape the practice at this stage.
I will say that culture is so important because I've worked in bad offices, and you can love the work that you're doing and be turned off in doing the work because of who you're working with, and not want to do that work, which is, really sad. And so I can teach, when we have people apply to our office, I don't look at their resume, looking at their transcript. I don't care about your grades because I can teach you how to do the stuff. I can dress you up and I can teach you how to do this, but I care about your character because I can't teach that. And you're also going to be working alongside other people that want to enjoy the place that they're working and the work that they do. And so there are so many times where we fight with opposing counsel, we fight with judges. Sometimes we fight with clients who think that we're not
Yes.
doing enough to fight with the judges and the opposing counsel. And so we can feel like we're getting it from all sides. Our office has to be a refuge. It has to be a safe place. And it's, how I treat my staff means so much more than what I communicate to them about what I say our values are. Same thing in the church, honestly. And so when people see that that's what we're really about, then yeah, they're going to be drawn to that. When our staff, our culture in our office sees, yeah, that's what we're really all about, it sort of raises the watermark and everybody sort of agrees and we're all on the same page and we're all working together towards fighting for justice in the community. It's a lot easier to do because we're all on the same page.
So I want you to go ahead and pitch your book. Tell us where we can find it.
Yeah, so the book is Fire in the Hole, and Whole is WHOLE, because the subtitle is Embracing Our Righteous Anger with White Christianity and Reclaiming Our Wholeness. It can be found anywhere that books are sold, so Barnes & Noble, Amazon, your local bookstore. You can find it on my website, which is robertgcallahan.com. You can find me on social media. I'm on pretty much everything: YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, RIP, Instagram, all those things at R. Callahan Waco is usually what my handle is.
Okay. And then if we just want to dive a little further, having read your book, is there anyone that you would recommend, another book that you would recommend me pick up?
Yeah, right now I'm rereading James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And it's really insightful. I would also recommend highly Kristen Kobes de May, who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, and Beth Allison Barr, who wrote Becoming the Pastor's Wife, and what was her first book was, brain fart. Okay, sorry. So Kristen Kobes de May, who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, and Beth Allison Barr, who wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood and On Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Those are really insightful things that were part of my transition. So, yeah.
How does your family feel about this change? Your wife?
So, we have been married 21 years this year, and so we've really grown in our faith together. But this version of me, she'll tell you, is a much healthier, much more respectful, a better friend to her and father to our family. And so I hope that I dedicated the book to her and to our children and everyone that saw the fire in me and valued it, thought it was a good thing. And so I hope to be doing right by them.
Awesome. And I know for me, it's the spheres of influence, right? I can make the biggest impact at home. After that, obviously my profession, my career, my community organizations, etc. But there's nothing like home where you can make that difference.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being
you.
on.
I appreciate it.
Such a pleasure to meet you in person. I always see you on a screen. Listen to what you have to say. So good to meet you in person. And thank you for being our guest.
Likewise, thank you.